Okay, and welcome to the Simply Verified Beef podcast. And today we have a little bit of a different topic format, but the topic for today is practical genetic improvement. So I've got a couple of guests here today, Kajal Devani from the Canadian Angus Association and Sean McGrath, who wears many hats as a producer and consultant and all of the fun stuff. So before we get into things, maybe I'll get Kajal and Sean to just introduce yourselves. Kajal, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, Amy, and thanks so much for the invitation to bring genetic selection into the conversation about solutions that VBP Plus promotes to help address some of the challenges and opportunities in the Canadian beef industry today. Having grown up on a farm in Kenya, I've always been passionate about genetic selection as an agricultural tool. And I've been fortunate enough, as you said, to lead the breed improvement team at the Canadian Angus Association for the past 13 years now. So I'm very excited to be part of this discussion today.
Excellent. And Sean?
Yeah, super. Thanks, Amy. Thank you for the invitation. I guess I've started my career working with the Charolais Association a long time ago and have since branched out into genetic and breed improvement programs with a bunch of different breeds, deal a lot with extension, and then fortunate to have the opportunity to sort of deploy the tactics and genetic selection at home on our own ranch and kind of see the results and get our hands dirty that way. So that's kind of where we fit. And yeah, thank you for the invitation.
Right on. Well, so today, just from a VBP Plus perspective, as the auditors go and they're doing their auditing things and as the program develops, we talk about continuous improvement because even though you've passed an audit or you're a certified producer, we always want to sort of be striving for that continuous improvement. So a lot of the conversations that are being had about some of those types of things. Now, genetic improvement is one that sometimes does get overlooked as a tactic because it's not a solar panel watered bowl or something that people kind of recognize as being very innovative. However, just with some of the technologies and tools that are out there, I think that there's a lot of value that focusing on genetics can give us. So I'm really happy to have you folks here today. So I guess we'll just start with maybe a quick Coles Note version of how data collection can be utilized to make mating decisions. And we're trying to not get too far down into the weeds here and keep things high level. And we can put some resources in the show notes maybe. But Kajal, would you like to give just sort of what that looks like from a national database perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly believe if you're recording information, you should use it. And if you submit it to a breed association or another party to help standardize it and transform it into an easy to use either in-herd or cross-herd selection tools, that's probably the easiest. So Sean and I both represent breed associations in various forms. And really, the association is a centralized place at CAA for Canadian Angus seed stock producers to record pedigree, performance, and genomic information. And then we're able to compile all this information together and provide producers with either in-herd selection tools like adjusted weights, indexes, or ratios, basically ranking animals within appropriate groups for comparison. We also use this information to generate cross-herd selection tools, namely genomically enhanced expected progeny differences, or GEPDs for short.
Excellent. And Sean, how does that key in maybe with that producer lens on?
Yeah, so I sort of look at it from different levels. So a seed stock producer who's providing genetics to the industry probably needs to collect a lot more data than potentially their commercial customer does. And really where that data has value is not in data itself. It's the part Kajal talked about. It's in the transformation of that to information that we can use to make decisions. So that's really where the rubber meets the road, kind of at the producer level, is getting that information out of the data and then applying it at home on a set of cows.
Right, that makes sense. And if we back up a little bit, and Kajal mentioned the expected progeny differences and the GEPDs that are enhanced by genomic information, how are those things made? And I know that this is a topic that needs a whole nother hour on its own, but just maybe a quick and dirty on what makes up those EPDs?
Yeah, for sure. So like I said, we use pedigree, performance, and genomic information. So, every animal that we record has a pedigree that almost goes down to day one. We record performance information on animals that's coupled with group or management group information. So we will collect information from conception. We collect breeding information, and that goes towards us trying to assess fertility. We collect calving ease information as calves get born, birth weight, and watch them grow. So we can describe growth genetics by taking, birth weights and then weights during the animal's growth period at weaning and yearling. And then there are traits of economic relevance like carcass quality, but also traits that impact efficiencies like feed intake, longevity or stayability for some breed associations. I mentioned fertility, but also things that contribute to longevity, such as foot structure or teeth and udder structure. And the genomics really help because the methodology that we use to generate EPDs, where we try and use the phenotype and that management group information to estimate how much the environment contributed to that phenotype and tease out what the genetic potential is for breeding stock, because that's really what you're buying when you purchase a bull. You're not really buying his phenotype. You're actually wanting his genotype. You're actually wanting what he is going to contribute to his progeny and how different his progeny will be from another bull that you might potentially buy. And that's what you're really investing in. So that's what genomically enhanced EPDs really describe for you. And the genomics just helps us make them more accurate because they're estimate or a prediction, right? So that accuracy, especially on younger animals that aren't proven, is really valuable to us. And we can talk about, breeding goals and the rate of genetic change and how that's impacted by accuracy, especially considering the long generation interval in beef. And we have some resources. I know Sean has quite a few. Like Sean said, he does a lot of extension work, but if people really want to see it, and I always believe it's easier to see a methodology like that when you have something like slides or something visual to follow. We do have Genomics 101 and an EPD 101 YouTube video on the Canadian Angus YouTube channel if anybody's interested in checking that out.
We can put that in the show notes, the link to that, if anybody's looking to dig a little deeper.
Perfect. Yeah. To me, GEPDs are undoubtedly the best tool available to help identify animals with the best genetic potential to use as seed stock or breeding animals. So I think that translation from that raw information that you collect, that producers collect, like Sean said, the transformation of that information into something that you can use to make selection decisions, that's where the value really is.
Yeah, for sure. And so an EPDs, generally speaking, are good within that breed genetic evaluation, but there are some methods that you can use to compare between breeds. If you're a commercial producer that just wants to compare Angus with a Simmental with a Hereford or whatever the case might be, what would your recommendation to those producers be?
So what we're really kind of touching on is trying to match that genetic potential in a crossbreeding system to still, use different breeds, capture that hybrid vigor, but still have a consistent group of cows that kind of aren't all over the map. So there are some tools. I know the USDA Meat Animal Research Center produces every year a set of adjustment factors that we can apply to those EPDs. It's a little bit of an involved process, so we can sort of scale an Angus EPD to a Hereford EPD and kind of compare. A lot of the breeds, so some of the breeds like Simmental, Solaire, Limousin, use a common evaluation. So those results are directly comparable with each other, but may not be comparable with some of the other major breeds, Hereford, Angus, Charolais, for example. So those conversion factors come into effect a little bit. In an organized crossbreeding system, trying to produce maternal female side, we want to maximize hybrid vigor. We want bulls of different breeds, but of similar type and similar EPD profiles in a terminal situation. So, just as an off the cuff example, if I was going to breed a Charolais to a Hereford Angus cross cow or a Sim Angus cow to produce feeder cattle, I would want those EPDs to be quite different and divergent. So we'd add a bunch of growth and yield potentially to those terminal type calves that are just going to go on feed. So there's a few tools out there. Like I say, the USDA Meat Animal Research Center produces updated adjustment factors every year that can be applied. And we still do want to use some visual assessment and common sense and kind of stay on type and similar characteristic in those maternal type cattle.
Yeah, for sure. We talk about numbers, but there's a balance that needs to happen to have that phenotype in those feet and legs. And some of the data might not be caught up from a numbers perspective to have that accuracy quite yet.
Yeah, and there's an art to it and understanding what you're trying to accomplish, right? And that helps a lot.
Super. So one of the things that I wanted to chat about, feed efficiency is one thing that's bubbling to the top of a few different conversations. The first being some of this carbon sequestration and methane production and making sure we can grow more beef with the same amount of resources and the economics of that as well. Just strict economics. You've come out of a couple years of drought or this, that, and the other thing where we want to make sure that we're doing things efficiently. So it's not necessarily a new concept, but there's some tools that have been launched here in the last little while, along with some of the genomic profiling that has bubbled up to have a semblance of accuracy to it. So maybe guys could comment on how those RADG and DMI numbers in the EPD get established and maybe what's ground truthing that genomic testing.
Sure. So we're actually quite fortunate in Canada. We have a made in Canada solution in regards to feed efficiency or measuring feed intake and thus feed efficiency in cattle. And there's a significant correlation between feed intake, feed efficiency, and greenhouse gas emissions. The more efficient cattle are, the less greenhouse gas emissions are associated with those cattle. And considering that, 70% of your operating budget goes into feed, I think it's of economic relevance to producers as well. So at Canadian Angus, we have, Amy, you mentioned an RADG EPD. So that's residual average daily gain, and it describes an animal's ability to grow post-weaning on a constant amount of feed. So RADG is expressed in terms of pounds per day, and it's a predictor of a sire's genetic ability for post-weaning gain in future progeny compared to that of another sire's, given a constant amount of feed consumed. So as an example, a bull with an RADG EPD of plus 1.5 will sire calves that on average will grow 1 pound extra per day more than another bull with, say, an RADG EPD of 0.5 on the same amount of feed. So you're constricting the feed variable, and you're saying with a constricted amount of feed variable, this is how much more pounds a day of growth I'm going to get. You also mentioned, Amy, dry matter intake EPD or a DMI EPD. This describes just feed intake potential, but it does not couple it with gain. So it's a more complicated EPD to use because a producer needs to couple that with gain for themselves. So I always caution that if you're going to use that, make sure you understand what it's describing. And then some breed associations have an RFI EPD, which is a little bit different in that it couples feed intake and gain, but it holds the gain constant, and it describes how much more feed it will take to attain that gain. So a little bit switched around which variable it holds constant and which variable it's describing, whether it's feed or gain. But, we're so fortunate that we have systems like GrowSafe systems that allow us to measure this, because without measuring a phenotype, it's very difficult to apply genomics and say, well, this genomic test will tell me this. It doesn't work like that. We don't know how to read that book of genotypes unless we have the story, the actual physical story to couple it with. So measuring feed intake is going to become more and more the norm and frequently practiced so that we have enough information to describe the genetics that we need to be using.
Yeah, I would echo that, Kajal. That last statement I think is really important for the industry. It's really important for us to measure those phenotypes and collect feed intake data on individual animals so that we can identify in those genes and those genomics, those markers that can help us, on a bigger industry scale. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that every calf in Canada is not going to go through a grow safe system, a very, very small percentage. But by collecting that data and working with it through some of the organizations and organized groups like breed associations, we can identify the genomic markers that we can expand across industry at an affordable price to at least gain some insights into those traits, because they do drive a lot of the bottom line and address a lot of the climate concerns that we need to address as an industry.
Yeah, right on. One of the things that the Maritime Beef Test Station has, and we've been very lucky in the Maritimes here to have access to Grow Safe. So the bulls that are sent down on consignment of all breeds are tested against each other for feed efficiency, and they do a little bit of a different genetic evaluation within those bulls that are down there to do that across breed comparison. So sometimes we chat about it and we forget about how lucky and some of these tools that we do have access to that us just in the little old Maritimes has to really do some good selection and to drive some of those data points, because some of these bulls and the herds that the bulls are coming out of, I mean, since the 80s and 90s, some of these herds have been using the Maritime Beef Test Station. So they've been getting some of that data back and putting it through, hopefully, the breed associations so that the folks like Kajal and Sean and the team there can do some work with it.
You bring up a really good point, though, because you said, it's a smaller bull test station, it's a smaller number of animals, but the point of having breed associations, or we have a new initiative I know you're going to talk about in another segment called the Canadian Beef Improvement Network. The point of having centralized places for data to be recorded and transformed, it's really important. And I don't think that everybody understands that. So I know some producers who measure things and record things, and they might use that information for in-herd selection decisions or management decisions. But it's really important to record them in a centralized place, because every little piece of data goes towards making these tools more accessible and accurate for the entire industry. And so you're helping a lot of people access tools with your little bit of information, because, think of it as drops in a sea, a little bit here and a little bit here and a little bit here. It creates an entire movement. And EPDs are actually a very easy way to move that herd average, but also that breed average. If you just identify the bottom animals and make culling decisions on these animals, you can move the average for an entire breed. So I think you've brought up a really good point. If you're measuring things, please record them so that they can go to enhance the entire industry.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's critical. There's no sense in me just putting it in a notebook and putting it in a drawer and never looking at it again. And if I can just do a little bit extra work and send those into the respective places that can use them, then it helps everybody. Sean, on the topic of feed efficiency particularly, what is the heritability of that? Because we chat about it because we do have this Grow Safe system that we're selling bulls in the spring from the Maritime Beef Test Station. And so if you're going to start selecting maybe for that feed efficiency trait, if you haven't thought about it before, because we haven't had some of those data points available, what is the generation interval on that? Like, how long do you have to wait before maybe some differences start getting seen?
The heritability is actually pretty similar to growth traits. So we'd put it in the moderate category. So basically what that means is if I actually was to put pressure on it, I could see some change fairly quickly. The obvious example, if I take a bull and I'm producing feeder calves, I'll see it in the first generation if I'm feeding those calves out. Mm-hmm. If I'm trying to build that into my cow herd, that's obviously going to be a little longer process. So we're not going to really see the benefits in our cow herd until we start retaining heifers and replacing enough of that cow herd The other thing I think, and we indirectly probably selected for efficiency a little bit just by selection for growth, but we haven't put a lot of direct pressure on it as an industry. So even though the heritability is moderate, in the initial stages, the response will be larger than what the heritability might suggest, just because we haven't put any selection pressure on it in terms of like an industry scale. Feeder calves response is first generation. Cow herd, it just takes a little longer to work that in there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, super. So I guess wrapping up here, we don't want to take up too much of your time. And again, we could dive into a whole bunch of holes here, but do you have any recommendations for somebody who does not currently have any sort of genetic improvement plan other than just going to the bull sale and picking the one that looks best to them, of what some of those steps might be?
Well, Amy, I would say breeding goals is a significant conversation that we need to have over and over again, because it's really important. Genetic selection takes time. Every generation you make a little gain, and this gain builds every generation. It's cumulative. So you really need to identify your goals with the future in mind, and then you need to stick to them for several generations before you can really realize significant change. So I can't stress the importance of matching your genetics to your environment, or vice versa, enough, and foreseeing what those market demands will be and having breeding goals that reflect this. And, you know, people like Sean and I, that's our daily work, is to help producers identify these variables and come up with their breeding goals. So, you know, don't be afraid to pick up the phone and have a conversation with people like Sean or myself or other people in the industry that are here to help you do this. This doesn't have to be a one-person thing.
Yeah, and I would add to that, you know, sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge for some people, but I would add to that, you know, have open conversations with your bull supplier. Don't be scared to talk to them about what you're trying to do and what you want your farm or ranch or your cow herd to look like. They can't necessarily steer you to the right animal if they don't know what your goal is. And then the other, I think, practical piece of advice for people that maybe are sort of new to this, if you have some bulls or a bull that you've used that, you know, those heifers they've worked in my cow herd phenomenally, right? The beauty of having registered seed stock is you can actually go look that bull up on an association website, you know, go look him up, look at his EPDs, and that may give you a sort of an indication of, you know, if this bull worked fantastically well for me and I'm going to buy another bull of that breed, here's maybe a starting point on the numbers that may also work well in my herd, and kind of use that as a sort of a sounding board or a jumping off point to kind of get you centered on cattle that might work in your operation.
Yeah, for sure. Then Sean, that always drives me, the whole birth weight calving ease bull selection thing sort of drives me bonkers some days, because they will ask if I'm selling a bull. Sometimes the number is, higher than average for our breed, but we've had no problems. So like, we have this range where we're comfortable with, and we don't want to keep on selecting down and selecting down and selecting down, because we don't need that with the size of our cows, and we've had no problems. So what I try to tell folks is, like, you don't have to look for the top percentile or the bottom percentile on birth weight or whatever the case may be, because you may be putting yourself into something that you don't want to get yourself into either by selecting for a range that you don't necessarily need to be in for your environment. So anyhow,
and that's a fantastic point, and that's actually the start of this when we talked about continual improvement. Improvement isn't necessarily having the biggest or the highest number in every trait. Improvement is making small gains over time, and sometimes those gains mean moving to the middle of the spectrum, or, you know, accepting a little bit more if you're breeding cows, you don't need a heifer bull on cows. You know, it's maybe accepting a little bit more birth weight to get a bit more performance in those calves. Kajal said it really well. It's incremental gain over time. It's that continual improvement mindset, right? And yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, very good. So Kajal, they can find you folks at the Canadian Angus Association. I can put some stuff in the show notes if there's anything else that you'd like to provide as resources. We can put the Genomics 101 and some of those resources at Canadian Angus. And again, Kajal works for Canadian Angus, but those concepts will work for other breeds as well. I will put that preface out there. If I had enough time and money, I'd have good ones of them all. But that's just what we've got as resources today. So Kajal, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of leave with before we close?
No, I think this has been a great conversation, and I'm really glad you're having it through VBP, because I do believe genetic selection should be part of everybody's best practice. We can talk about EPDs and the best way to use them and how to match them to your environment and your market goals for days if you get Sean and I together. So again, I would say don't hesitate to engage your customers, engage your fellow producers, but also engage industry expertise. We love talking to producers and helping them, and that's our job. So don't hesitate if you have questions to reach out.
Right on. And Sean, any closing comments from you?
Well, first, thanks for the invitation again. And every operation is a little bit different. So every operation will need a little bit different bull to make that type of progress. And there's resources out there and good conversations to be had about what that might look like for your operation. So yeah, don't be scared to engage. That would be a point of encouragement, I think.
Awesome. And just a little plug for the Maritimers out there. We've got Sean's going to be coming out here this fall to do a herd procurement and replenishment Atlantic Beef School session with us. So if you're interested in hearing more, then you can have a captive audience with Sean and ask all the questions you want to get some really good input on making a plan for your own herd with the Atlantic Beef School. So really appreciate both of your time today, and we will sign off and we'll see you next month. And with that, I'd like to thank you for tuning in to season 2 of the Simply Verified Beef podcast. And if you could please recommend us to a friend or neighbor, that would be spectacular. And we'd like to give an extra shout out to our season 2 sponsor, the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, in collaboration with New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And we'd just like to thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next month.